It began with a question no one in the American army could truly answer. What should a tank be? A rolling fortress? A spearhead of steel? Or just another machine in a war that few believed would ever reach America's shores again? The year was 1939. Europe trembled on the edge of another catastrophe. Old alliances cracked under the weight of fear and ambition, and across the Atlantic the United States watched the storm build with a mixture of fascination and denial. The scars of the First World War had not yet faded. For most Americans, tanks were something foreign, European toys of war, lumbering beasts that belonged on someone else's battlefield. The US Army possessed fewer than 400 of them, many barely functional relics of a past age. Officers debated their purpose endlessly in quiet offices and echoing drill fields. Infantry generals saw them as support vehicles, meant to crawl alongside foot soldiers at a walking pace. Cavalry officers, meanwhile, dreamed of something fast and independent, mechanized steeds that could outmaneuver the enemy. But no one could agree, and so the tanks themselves became reflections of confusion. Thin-skinned, underpowered, designed by committees that feared innovation more than defeat. In those uncertain years, the tank was little more than an experiment. And yet somewhere in that fog of doctrine and delay, one engineer began to imagine something different. His name would not echo through history books like Patton or Eisenhower. He wore no medals, commanded no divisions, but his fingerprints would soon cover every battlefield of the Second World War. He was quiet, methodical, and stubborn, a man who believed that victory wasn't born from perfection, but from practicality. While others drew blueprints for theoretical machines that could rival Germany's panzers, he sketched something that could actually be built, something America could mass-produce by the tens of thousands. His name was Edmund Burke Gifford, an engineer at the Rock Island Arsenal who had spent years studying what made machines survive when everything else broke down. He wasn't a man of war, he was a man of efficiency. And he knew one thing the generals didn't. The next war would not be won by the best tank. It would be won by the tank that could arrive first, in numbers that overwhelmed imagination. In 1940, as Europe fell under Hitler's boots, Gifford presented his team's early concepts: a medium tank with a cast turret, welded hull, and a high-velocity 75mm gun mounted in a fully rotating turret. It was rugged, simple, and adaptable, but the Army's tank board dismissed it as unambitious. Too heavy to be a light tank, too light to be a heavy one. In their eyes, it was a compromise, a machine that didn't excel at anything. The engineers called it the M4 project. The Army called it unnecessary. At that time, the Army's attention was fixed on the M2 and the soon-to-be M3 Lee, a peculiar design that mounted its main gun in a side sponson, unable to rotate fully. It looked outdated the moment it rolled off the assembly line, but it was approved because it fit doctrine, not reality. The Army liked what it already understood, and Gifford's design challenged too much at once. He was told to revise it, simplify it, make it more interim. That word, interim, would haunt him for years. It meant temporary, disposable, unworthy of long-term investment. But war has a way of sweeping aside committees. In 1940, the German blitzkrieg rolled across France. The world watched as panzers crushed the French army in 6 weeks. The shockwave reached Washington like thunder after lightning. Suddenly, every general who had doubted armor began asking the same question. How soon could America build a real tank? Factories that had produced tractors, refrigerators, and automobiles were asked to prepare for something else. The Chrysler Corporation received blueprints for armored hulls. Ford began experimenting with tank engines. The industrial heart of America, long dormant after the Depression, began to beat again. And in the shadows of that awakening, Gifford's design returned from the scrap heap. It wasn't perfect, but it could be built now. He worked with a small team through nights lit by acetylene torches, testing suspension systems stolen from older models, adjusting armor slopes with the chalk lines and intuition. He cared less about elegance and more about survivability. If a part failed, it needed to be replaced in minutes. If the engine overheated, it needed to be fixable with tools already in a mechanic's hand. By late 1941, the prototype was ready, the M4 Sherman. It weighed 30 tons, carried 5 men, and rolled forward with a simple promise: reliability over everything else. But even then, the Army hesitated. Reports from Europe spoke of the German Panzer IV, heavier armour, higher velocity guns, precision optics. To many, the Sherman looked weak. The engineers were told to stand by for revisions that never came. Then on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. Everything changed overnight. The interim tank that had sat in a warehouse for testing suddenly became the centerpiece of America's armor doctrine. There was no time left for perfection. The question wasn't, is it the best? It was, can we build it fast enough? Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and California began roaring like furnaces of steel. Conveyor belts stretched for miles. Casting molds turned molten metal into armor plates. Thousands of men and women, many of whom had never seen a tank before, now shaped them by hand. And as the first units rolled off the line in February 1942, Gifford watched in silence. The machine he had designed out of compromise, the one the army didn't want, was now the face of America's war. Soldiers met it with skepticism. They called it the Ronson because it lit up easily when hit. They cursed its thin armour, its tendency to burn, its struggle against the German Tigers and Panthers that loomed in Europe. But they also learned something the enemy didn't expect. The Sherman didn't need to win every duel. It just needed to be there, again and again and again. When one burned, two more took its place. When parts failed, new ones arrived by the crate. A single German Tiger could destroy 5 Shermans, but America could build 10 before breakfast. It wasn't the strongest or the prettiest or the most advanced. But it was alive in a way the others weren't, moving, adapting, evolving faster than the war could keep up. In that sense, the Sherman became something more than a tank. It became a symbol, of America's industrial will, of Gifford's defiance, of an engineer's quiet revenge on a system that once called him impractical, and soon the world would see what an unwanted machine could really do. By the time the first Shermans reached North Africa in late 1942, the world had changed beyond recognition. America had entered the war not as a reluctant observer, but as a force of nature, a country that could build a ship faster than the enemy could sink it, an army that could land on any shore with 1,000 engines roaring behind it. Yet on the desert sands of Tunisia, where the air shimmered with heat and the horizon blurred between mirage and reality, the Sherman was about to face its first true test. No amount of engineering theory could predict what it felt like to fight across a land where sand infiltrated everything. Gearboxes, sights, lungs. The crews were young, many barely trained. Their tank was new, unproven, and the enemy waiting for them had been fighting since Poland, since France, since the beginning. The Afrika Korps, lean, seasoned, ruthless. When the first Shermans rolled off the landing ships, coated in dust and salt spray, the soldiers stared at them like strange creatures. Their curved armour glinted in the sun, their turrets moved smoothly, their engines hummed with a distinct growl. Mechanics wiped their hands and nodded quietly. For the first time, they had something that felt like a real tank. But war has no patience for pride. At Kasserine Pass, the Shermans met the Panzers, head-on in confusion, through smoke and terror. The German guns tore through the first wave with surgical precision. Some Shermans burned where they stood, their crews clawing out of hatches that warped in the heat. Others kept moving, returning fire through cracked sights and shaking hands. The battlefield became an inferno of steel. Reports from the front trickled back to Washington, grim, conflicting, impossible to interpret. The Sherman had performed well in some sectors, catastrophically in others. Critics called it undergunned, under-armoured. But beneath the chaos, something important was happening. The Shermans that survived didn't stay broken for long. Mechanics in the field learned how to patch them with whatever they could find, spare tracks welded to the sides, sandbags piled on hulls, extra armour plates scavenged from wrecks. The tank was evolving not in design, but in spirit. German tanks were precision machines, masterpieces of engineering. But they broke down as often as they fought. Their engines overheated, their transmissions failed, their complexity made them fragile. The Sherman was crude by comparison, but it was simple. A busted track could be fixed in an hour. A damaged engine could be swapped in a day. For every tank that burned, another took its place before sunset, and that quietly became America's advantage. When Kasserine ended, the battlefield was littered with wreckage, both German and American. But deep in that wreckage, the Sherman had earned something invaluable, the trust of its crews. In letters home, tank commanders described it as forgiving, honest, even friendly. It moved when you needed it to move. It fired when you needed it to fire. It was, in their words, a tank that wanted to keep you alive. Edmund Gifford read those letters in a small office back home, surrounded by blueprints and coffee-stained memos. The same army officers who had once doubted him now sent urgent requests for upgrades, variants, replacements. He worked 12 hours a day, sometimes more, refining suspension systems, improving gun stabilizers, redesigning armor plates for easier welding. And as he worked, the factories multiplied. In Detroit, the massive Chrysler arsenal became a city within a city. Endless rows of smokestacks and cranes, the clatter of steel, the thunder of foundries shaking the ground. In Ohio, women welded armor plates while their husbands fought overseas. In California, school children watched trains of Shermans roll past on their way to the ports, their olive-drab paint still fresh. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't romantic, but it was unstoppable. By the time the Allies prepared to invade Sicily, America was producing nearly 2,000 tanks a month, and with every shipment came lessons learned in blood. Crews began asking for more power, thicker armour, a bigger gun. Gifford's team responded with incremental improvements, the M4A2, the M4A3, the Firefly conversion in Britain that mounted a deadly 17-pounder. But through it all, the heart of the machine remained the same. Simple, reliable, adaptable. In Sicily and Italy, the Sherman climbed hills that would have stalled heavier tanks. It crossed rivers, smashed through vineyards, pushed artillery out of the mud. Its tracks left scars across Europe, one link at a time, and yet the doubts never fully disappeared. Rumours spread of new German monsters, the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, tanks that could kill a Sherman at 2 miles distance while shrugging off its shells like pebbles. The fear of them became legend long before most soldiers ever saw one. When reports of these giants reached Washington, panic followed. Senators demanded answers. Journalists wrote that American soldiers were being sent to fight steel giants with tin toys. Inside the Ordnance Department, Gifford fought to explain what few seemed to understand, that war was not a contest of one machine against another. It was a contest of systems, logistics, maintenance, production, replacement. A Tiger was fearsome, but each one required weeks of assembly, specialized parts, and excess transport fuel that Germany no longer had. A Sherman could be built in 5 days. He knew which equation would win, but knowing didn't make it easier to read casualty reports. Every destroyed tank carried names, faces, families. Every loss weighed on him personally. By 1943, American armour had learned to adapt. Shermans no longer fought German tanks head-on whenever possible. They worked in coordination, artillery support, infantry screens, air reconnaissance. Tank destroyers handled long-range duels. Shermans manoeuvred for speed and surprise. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. In the deserts of North Africa, through the rocky passes of Sicily, and across the muddy fields of Italy, the M4 Sherman carved its reputation, not as a superweapon, but as a survivor. Soldiers began to joke that it was like them, underestimated, overworked, but impossible to stop. Back home, newspapers began to print photos of Shermans rolling through captured towns. Children pointed at them and said, "That's our tank." For Edmund Gifford, that was enough. He didn't need statues or medals. He just wanted his machine to bring soldiers home. And now it was doing that and thousands of times over. But even as America celebrated its victories in Africa and Italy, a new storm was brewing, one that would push the Sherman and Gifford's philosophy to their breaking point. Because soon, the world's largest amphibious invasion was coming, and the tank that the army never wanted would have to carry the weight of it all. The nights before the invasion felt unreal. England was a single vast machine, engines rumbling in every field, ships crowding every harbour, soldiers sleeping under wings and hulls that would soon fill the sky and sea. Inside the camouflage nets and damp tents stood the Shermans, rows upon rows of them, engines covered in tarps, turrets turned toward the channel as if they already knew where they were going. Mechanics worked through drizzle and moonlight, adjusting tracks, checking radios, painting white stars that would soon be hidden by dust and blood. Each tank carried 5 men who had trained for months but still didn't know what waited for them on the other side. They smoked in silence, carved initials into armour, wrote letters that would never mention fear. Somewhere among them was a quiet recognition that the next sunrise would decide everything. For Edmund Gifford, now directing a team of engineers attached to the Ordnance Department in London, sleep was impossible. He walked the docks at Portsmouth, watching tanks being craned onto landing craft. Some had strange pipes jutting from their turrets, duplex drive conversions designed to swim ashore with canvas screens and propellers. Others were fitted with plows, flamethrowers, and rocket racks. Experiments born from desperation. Gifford had argued against some of them, but the war had grown beyond arguments. The Shermans were going, ready or not. June 6, 1944 dawned under grey clouds and gunfire. As the first waves of infantry hit the beaches, the swimming tanks followed. Many never made it. The sea was rougher than forecast promised. One after another, the DD Shermans vanished beneath the waves, their canvas screens collapsing, their crews trapped inside as salt water poured through hatches. Of the 29 tanks meant to land at Omaha with the first assault, only a handful reached the sand. Those that did emerge from the surf like beasts resurrected, water streaming off armour, guns already firing. They became moving shields for men pinned in the shingle. The Germans, dug into cliffs and concrete, turned the beach into a furnace. Shermans were hit, flipped, burned. Others clawed forward through obstacles that tore their tracks apart. Yet they kept coming. One tank, its name painted in chalk, courageous, took a direct hit to the turret, killing 2 crewmen instantly. The driver kept going. He rammed the wrecked hull of another Sherman to make a bridge over a ditch, then reversed, repositioned, and fired again. When his gun jammed, he turned the entire tank to use the coaxial machine gun as the only weapon left. That kind of improvisation wasn't in manuals. It was instinct, born of a machine simple enough to obey its crew even when half destroyed. By nightfall, Omaha was a graveyard of steel and bodies, but it was also a foothold. And among the wreckage, officers noticed something crucial. The few Shermans that survived the beach had become rallying points. Infantry followed them, hid behind them, gained courage from their movement. Where a tank advanced, morale advanced with it. As the days passed and more armour came ashore, the beachhead grew. The Shermans rolled inland through hedgerows, walls of earth, and roots older than any nation involved in the war. It was beautiful country, but for tanks it was hell. The narrow lanes trapped them. The hedges hid German guns waiting at every turn. Crews learned to listen for the metallic cough of a panther or the crack of an 88mm before they saw it. Often, by the time they did, it was too late. American losses were severe. Tank after tank was destroyed by ambushes invisible until the flash. For a while morale wavered. Commanders feared they were feeding men into a grinder. Then in the fields near St. Lo, innovation was born from frustration. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen, a New Jersey mechanic who had once worked on farm equipment, took a section of steel from a wrecked landing craft and welded it to the front of his Sherman, teeth like a giant rake. When his tank drove into the next hedgerow, it tore through the wall instead of climbing it. Word spread. Within weeks, nearly every Sherman in Normandy carried those improvised blades. They called them Cullen cutters. For the first time, the American armour moved freely through the bocage. The Germans lost their advantage of concealment. Gifford, hearing of the modification, smiled grimly. This was exactly what he had designed the Sherman for. Not perfection, but adaptability. A crew with a welder could reinvent the tank in an afternoon. Through July's choking dust and August's heat, the Shermans pushed yard by yard. They weren't invincible, but they were persistent. And persistence is the slowest form of inevitability. When the breakout came at St. Lo, it was like a dam bursting. Hundreds of Shermans roared forward behind thunderous artillery. German lines, overstretched and bombed from above, collapsed. Villages fell, then towns, then whole divisions. In the aftermath, a colonel wrote in his report, "The Sherman may not be the best tank on the field, but it is the last one still moving when the fight ends." The breakout from Normandy was a victory paid for in blood and gasoline. Crews who had survived D-Day now led columns across France. They named their tanks after hometowns, sweethearts, baseball teams. They painted kill marks on barrels, music notes on hulls, words of defiance in chalk that washed away after every rain. Behind them, supply convoys thundered with replacement parts, new engines, new guns. The American system worked like an organism. Factories breathing out tanks, ships exhaling them onto docks, men guiding them across continents. For every Panther destroyed, 10 Shermans replaced it. Still the arguments raged back home. Critics compared thickness of armour, muzzle velocities, kill ratios. They measured war in numbers, not in motion. But Gifford understood something those numbers could not show. The Sherman's greatest weapon was time. It bought time for soldiers to live, for commanders to plan, for an army to advance. Every day a Sherman survived, it carried the war closer to ending. By the fall of 1944, as the Allies liberated Paris and the front lines stretched toward Belgium, the Sherman had become a constant presence, its silhouette the geometry of liberation. Children waved as columns passed. Farmers saluted with raised fists. The tank that had once been unwanted was now the face of victory rolling through Europe. But the war was not finished with it yet. Ahead waited the dark forests of the Ardennes, the frozen roads of winter, and the last desperate counterattack of a dying Reich. There, amid snow and silence, the Sherman would meet its hardest test, and the engineer who had built it would discover what true endurance meant. By December 1944, most soldiers believed the war in Europe was nearly over. Paris was free, Allied lines stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, and rumours spoke of home by spring. The Shermans rolled along muddy roads between villages hung with white flags and shattered church bells. Crews relaxed, some for the first time in months, joking that the next tank column might drive straight into Berlin without firing a shot. Then the forest began to whisper again. In the pre-dawn dark of December 16th, the sky over the Ardennes erupted. Tracers arced through falling snow, artillery rolled like thunder against the mountains, and German armour poured through the mist. The Wehrmacht had launched one final gamble, a counter-offensive meant to split the Allied line in two. The surprise was total. American units, scattered and thin, suddenly faced veteran panzer divisions pushing through the frozen woods. The Sherman crews woke to a world turned white and silent except for engines struggling to start in sub-zero air. Frost rimed the barrels. Men warmed their hands on exhaust vents. Radios hissed half messages drowned by static. Somewhere to the east, a village was burning blue in the snow. When the first Panthers appeared out of the fog, their shells tore through trees and men alike. For a moment, the American line buckled. Whole companies were overrun. Fuel dumps exploded. Columns of refugees clogged the roads. But then the Shermans, dozens of them, began to move. Slowly at first, then with purpose. They were undergunned, out-armoured, but they knew the ground. They fought not in open duels, but in ambushes, firing from behind barns, reversing into orchards, vanishing among drifts. At Bastogne, the 10th Armoured Division used its Shermans like sentinels. They covered every road leading into town, each tank a frozen bunker, crews sleeping inside their steel shells because the cold outside could kill faster than shrapnel. Ammunition ran low, food ran out. When the Germans surrounded the city and demanded surrender, the answer came in one word: nuts. The siege lasted days that felt like centuries. Snow muffled the world, breath hung in clouds inside the tanks. Men tore pages from manuals to start fires. Yet every morning the Sherman still ran. Engines coughed, gears ground, and the turrets turned toward whatever came through the trees. Some tanks were so iced over that their crews had to chip open the hatches with bayonets. But they fought on. When relief finally arrived, Patton's Third Army punching north through the storm, it was led, fittingly, by more Shermans. They crawled over drifts taller than their hulls, tracks squealing, exhausts flaming against the night. The sight of them brought men in Bastogne to tears. To the infantry, who had been encircled for a week, those olive-drab silhouettes were more than machines. They were salvation made of steel and willpower. In the aftermath, analysts tried once again to count the cost. Hundreds of Shermans destroyed, dozens of crews lost, but the offensive had failed. The German army had spent its last reserves of fuel and men. Their vaunted Tigers, though terrifying, could not be replaced. The Shermans, battered and patched with snow-blackened welds, would simply keep going. By February, as the thaw began, the forests gave up their dead and the Allied columns rolled east once more. Town after town fell in quick succession. Cologne, Remagen, the Rhine crossings. Everywhere the same scene repeated. Civilians emerging from cellars, staring at the tanks with the white star painted on the sides. Some touched the armour as if to prove it was real. Children climbed onto turrets. Soldiers handed them rations through hatches. The engineer who had built the first prototype watched these images in newsreels. Gifford had aged 10 years in 3. He saw the smoke, the faces, the endless parade of his creation rolling through a continent torn apart, and he felt pride mixed with something heavier. He knew how many had died inside those hulls. He knew each improvement came too late for someone. But he also knew the alternative, a war lost before it began. When the Shermans crossed the Rhine, bridges trembling beneath their weight, the German command finally understood that numbers could become destiny. For every tiger still guarding the homeland, there were 20 Shermans coming for it. The Allies advanced like an ocean tide, slow, relentless, indifferent to the shape of the rocks ahead. In April 1945, near the town of Dessau, an American armoured column linked up with Soviet forces coming from the east. The men shook hands atop the hoods of their tanks. The war in Europe was over. Crews climbed down for the last time, taking off helmets they had worn for years. They looked at the machines that had carried them across deserts, hedgerows and snowfields. Some patted the armour as if saying goodbye to an old friend. Others turned away without a word, unwilling to remember the ghosts sealed within. Edmund Giffard received a letter from the Army Ordnance Chief, thanking him for his service to the cause of victory. He read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. There was no ceremony for engineers, no parade for draftsmen. But in that quiet moment, he understood the strange legacy of his creation. It had been hated, doubted, cursed, and it had endured. The tank the army never wanted had become the one it could not have won without. Victory did not sound like triumph. It sounded like engines going quiet. Across Europe, the guns fell silent one by one, and the world began to listen again to the wind. Fields that had burned now carried the smell of wet spring. In shattered towns, the echo of boots gave way to birdsong. For the first time in 6 years, men could hear themselves think. The Shermans stood everywhere, lined along roadsides, scattered in meadows, half buried in mud. Some were still warm from their last run, others already stripped for scrap by children who would grow up calling them playgrounds. They had become part of the landscape, like monuments built by accident. Their crews climbed down for the final time, stretching legs that felt unsteady on solid ground. There was laughter, yes, but it carried an edge of disbelief. When you live inside a machine long enough, the silence after war feels louder than any cannon. Edmund Giffard flew to Europe that summer with a small delegation from the Ordnance Department. He walked among the wrecks outside Frankfurt, touching armour pitted with shrapnel, tracing serial numbers he recognised from his own ledgers. Some still bore chalk notes from factory floors back in Detroit, inspection marks, initials, small jokes scrawled by welders before paint was applied. He wondered how many of those men had sons who had fought inside these same machines. In one village square he found a Sherman still running. A corporal from Kansas had kept it alive with spare parts scavenged from 3 others. The tank's name, Lucky 7, was painted in fading white letters on the turret. Its engine coughed but didn't quit. When Giffard asked how many miles it had travelled, the corporal shrugged. "All of them, oh, yeah, all of them," he said, and smiled the tired smile of someone who no longer needed to exaggerate. Everywhere the engineer went, he saw his design repurposed. Farmers used broken hulls as tractors. Allied engineers converted them into bulldozers to clear debris, medics into ambulances to ferry the wounded home. The Sherman had survived the war only to begin rebuilding the peace. That, Giffard thought, might be its finest moment. Back in the United States, the factories slowed. The women who had welded armour returned to offices, to schools, to kitchens that suddenly felt too quiet. Conveyor belts once filled with steel now carried washing machines, cars, and toys. America was learning to make peace the same way it had learned to make war, by mass production. Yet beneath the surface ran a strange nostalgia for the rhythm of those years, for the clarity that comes when a nation has a single purpose. The newspapers printed photographs of victory parades, columns of Shermans rolling through Manhattan beneath falling confetti, generals saluting from open turrets. The crowd saw heroes, Giffard saw statistics. He knew how many of those tanks had returned home empty, how many others lay rusting in European rain. He thought about the men who had cursed his machine when it failed, and blessed it when it didn't, and he felt the kind of pride that hurts to hold. Historians would spend decades arguing about the Sherman. They would compare armour thicknesses, muzzle velocities, turning radii. They would draw tables proving that German tanks were superior, that Soviet numbers were greater, that American doctrine was flawed. But none of those tables could capture what the crews knew, that the tank you could trust was the one that started every morning no matter the weather, and carried you far enough to see another dawn. In occupied Germany, the Sherman stayed behind as part of the peace. They patrolled borders, guarded depots, escorted trains filled with refugees. Children climbed onto them and carved their names into the paint. The American star became a symbol not of invasion, but of stability. Villages rebuilt around them. Roads paved by their tracks turned into highways of a new Europe. When Gifford finally returned home, he found himself a stranger in his own country. The war had ended, but its noise still lived inside him. He spent months visiting assembly plants being converted for civilian use, helping to design farm tractors based on the Sherman's suspension. He said little about what he felt, only that machines should always serve life, not destroy it. Those who worked with him noticed he paused before every drawing as if listening for ghosts hidden in the graphite lines. The years passed. The army moved on to new designs, heavier, faster, armed for a new kind of war, already whispering from across the oceans. The M26 Pershing, the Patton series, the beginning of the jet age. Yet in faraway countries, the Sherman kept fighting. In Korea, in the Middle East, in jungles and deserts its builders would never see. The same rounded turret still turned toward new horizons. It refused to die. When journalists asked Gifford near the end of his life what he thought of his creation, he answered softly, "It wasn't the best tank. It was the one we could build." Sometimes that's enough. He meant it not as humility but as truth. The perfect is the enemy of the possible, and in war the possible is what saves you. He died before he could see the museums, the restorations, the reenactors painting stars on freshly polished armour. Before he could see children climbing into turrets pretending to drive through history. But maybe that was right. His work was never meant to be myth. It was meant to be useful. And somewhere, even now, a few of his machines still move, on parade grounds, on back roads, in the memories of the last men who served inside them. When their engines start, the sound carries a note older than technology, older than war, the sound of endurance. In the years that followed, the noise of the war faded but never disappeared. It echoed in the ticking of factory clocks, in the rumble of freight trains crossing the continent, in the restless hum of a nation that had learned it could do the impossible if it tried hard enough. America had entered the war half-prepared, uncertain, divided in opinion, and had merged something entirely new. The country that once debated whether it even needed tanks now built highways wide enough for them to drive on. Its factories, born from urgency, became engines of prosperity. Suburbs replaced barracks, but the rhythm was the same. Construction, motion, forward momentum. The ghost of the assembly line never stopped moving. For the men who had fought inside the Sherman, the war became a story told at kitchen tables and reunions, sometimes proud, sometimes painful. They remembered the smell of oil and cordite, the metal warmth on their hands after firing, the way the ground shook when the engine caught. They remembered names etched on hulls. Lucky 7, Carolina Dream, Old Faithful. Some could still hear the clatter of the tracks when they closed their eyes. Many never spoke of it at all. They built houses, raised children, learned how to be ordinary again. But every now and then, passing a construction site or a farm tractor, they would pause at the familiar sound of gears shifting and think of a winter morning somewhere far away when a machine had saved their lives. The Sherman became a relic, then a monument. Museums restored them to perfect shine, their paint too fresh, their turrets frozen in salute. Tourists looked at them and saw history. Veterans looked at them and saw absence, their own youth trapped behind glass. Edmund Gifford's name appeared only in technical manuals and procurement memos. His photographs gathered dust in archives. Yet his idea, the stubborn belief that reliability mattered more than glory, lived on in every engineer who built something meant to endure. Bridges, planes, computers, satellites all carried a fragment of that lesson. Build what works, build what lasts, build what will still be standing when the idealists are gone. Historians still argue about whether the Sherman was a good tank. They measure its armour, its gun, its losses, but the numbers miss the point. The tank's greatness was never in its specifications. It was in its availability, its persistence, its capacity to be repaired faster than it was destroyed. In the calculus of survival, that was genius enough. By the time the century turned, the last Shermans that could still run were driven out only on anniversaries. Their engines coughed smoke like breath from an old soldier. Crowds cheered, though few of them knew what the machine had meant. The veterans smiled, waved, and let the cheers wash over them. It was easier that way. And somewhere in those cheers, beneath the music and the flags, was the quiet truth the engineer had known from the beginning. Victory is not about perfection. It is about persistence. It is about ordinary men in ordinary machines doing the extraordinary because someone gave them the tools to try. The war ended decades ago, but its machines still whisper the same message. They tell it in the grind of their gears, in the weight of their armour, in the silence that follows when the engines stop. They remind us that history is built not by the flawless, but by the determined. In every museum hall where a Sherman stands beneath soft light, its paint dull and scarred, there is a stillness that feels almost alive. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of a factory floor, the clang of hammers, the voice of a man saying quietly that good enough is sometimes what saves the world. The engineer never lived to see the world his machine helped make, but his creation outlived him by generations. It crossed deserts and rivers, oceans and time. It carried a nation's will on its back and returned it home, battered but intact. And so the story ends where it began, not in triumph, not in tragedy, but in the steady hum of a machine doing its job. The tank the army didn't want rolled through history anyway, and in its wake came the sound of a people discovering what they were capable of when they stopped waiting for perfection and started building for endurance. That sound, even now, is the sound of America's heartbeat.